Hi, welcome to the Future of Procurement panel discussion. This is going to be an exciting one, and I'm really privileged to sit here and have this conversation with a couple of my oldest colleagues. When I say oldest, not in terms of age, but in terms of length of time that we've been collaborating and working together, Professor Chris Yukins and Ms. Magda Theodate. And I would say at the outset that both of them have been instrumental and influential in guiding the work of the Caribbean Procurement Institute in the Caribbean, supporting our programs and coming and helping to build what we had over there over the last decade. And so I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk with you guys right here. I'm now in the UK. Chris, you're in the US. Magda, you're also in the US now. It's just a pleasure to have you all here and for us to now be thinking about procurement policy, procurement law and practice from a global perspective and looking at the interactions and looking at the interplay from different jurisdictions and also from different disciplines. So I'd just like to first introduce, so welcome and thank you for joining me, yeah? Yeah, and so first, I would like to introduce Professor Chris Yukins, who is from the George Washington Law School and runs the government procurement law program there and is one of the voices and he would say, not a thought leader, he has corrected me on this in the past, a bridge builder in the procurement profession. And he certainly has all over the world sharing his perspectives and now doing some really incredible classes, master classes and webinars online for lawyers and professionals engaged with procurement all over the world. He has written several books on this issue and has published a plethora of papers that I could not cite for you, but when you hear him, you would recognize he's one of the voices. If he's saying this is what's going on in procurement, we should pay attention. Not always agree, Chris and I may not agree, but you must pay attention to because it is always considered and based. And we have a procurement law and policy expert and a lawyer in her own right, but also a global trade expert. And so she brings that perspective, Magda brings the perspective of that interconnection, that intersection between procurement and trade that sometimes is obscure, but when we begin to talk about it, you recognize, wait a minute, there's a huge overlap here, and therefore there are huge opportunities, which kind of speaks to a paper that Magda and I were involved in writing during COVID, and maybe we will get to talking about that paper that the UN has now published. And in this conversation, we'll also be looking at papers that both Professor Chris Yukins and Magda have independently authored with other authors as well. During the COVID, we've all been sharing and writing on the future of procurement, given what we've experienced in COVID. And so I don't know if you all want to say a couple words before we start. I guess not.
No, yeah, that's all right.
I just wanted to, if you want to say hi, welcome, good to be here.
I'd like to say a couple of words. Margaret, thank you for the kind introduction, and it's a pleasure to be with Chris as well on this panel because we've crossed each other's paths a couple of times, but we've never had an opportunity to really work together, and this has been a wonderful collaboration. I also want to add that although I am in the US right now, my company is based in Belize, and I work primarily in Latin America and the Caribbean, but also these days in Asia on public procurement advisory services and the intersection between global trade through my work as Director of Global Executive Trade. So thank you very much for sharing some of my background and allowing me to say a few words. Thank you everyone for being here as well.
Thank you. Chris, is there anything I could have added into your intro?
I wanted to say, I always agree with you, Margaret. I always agree with you. In all honesty, I do. What's interesting is that my position is, I'm a bridge builder, but I'm also a bridge, and my first bridge has to be into the American procurement system.
Right.
As a practical matter, the majority of the money spent by the U.S. government is spent on defense and national security, and so it means one of the bridges I have to build is to a very conservative, very dull bunch of national security types. That's my world. And so while it seems like I disagree with you, I actually agree with all your ideas. It's just I'm sort of dull by compulsion. That's the problem. Be a little bit more
I'm just pulling your leg. I'm pulling your leg because, with our deepest and most profound discussions, we certainly agree. We are all here trying to figure this out and how to make procurement more effective when governments are spending money for the quality of life. So how I think we can structure this discussion is, Chris, we can invite you to speak on the paper that you wrote and on lessons learned during the pandemic. And then we'll have Magda present on her paper. Then we can open up for a discussion where we may be able to get to the UN paper as well. Does that sound good?
Absolutely. And I want to talk a little bit about, have a starting point discussion for how we approach this topic. And because I think that this conference and the question of change and the future is really, it pivots on the pandemic. I think the pandemic is at the heart of all this, because the pandemic has forced us to rethink everything that we're doing. If we approach this, Margaret, as scientists would, we'd say, well, we have some hypotheses about what's happening and what's going to happen in the future, but we don't have all the facts. And logically, those hypotheses might change over time, and we might reach different conclusions at the end based on different facts that we're accumulating over the coming years. That would be a scientific approach. A political approach would say, no, you shape the narrative. You shape the narrative about where we're going to end up. And so there's a conflict between the two. And what I'm going to try to do in my presentation is straddle between the two. Approach it both as a scientist would, but also recognizing that I and others involved in a political discourse are trying to shape the narrative about where we're going. So some conclusions that we'll reach, for example, just basic things. By the end of the conversation, we're going to be talking about things like onshoring. The United States has announced that it's going to onshore production of essential medicines in order to prepare for the next catastrophe. The European Union has announced exactly the opposite. Are those scientific conclusions or are they political conclusions? And we'll talk about that. And a lot of trying to figure that out means talking about the facts and the circumstances. So let me begin. May I share a slide? Is that okay, Margaret?
Yes, please.
Okay. This slide comes from, it's a summary of a piece that I did with Laurence Folio-Lalio, she's a professor and a friend at the University of Paris-Nanterre. And she and I wrote a piece for Concurrency, which is an antitrust or competition publication. And we wrote it about what we're learning from the pandemic. And Laurence is a very accomplished continental academic. So she approaches things in a very highly structured way, very rigorous, logical way. And I'm going to build on that discussion, but also give some practical examples. So what we're talking about is more accessible. And she structured it in terms of 4 different disruptions that we've seen as a result of the pandemic in procurement. And I'm going to use those to talk about some bigger picture issues. So the first one she talked about, and we talked about, was a temporal disruption, that suddenly the luxury of time that we as procurement people who are not procurement experts wouldn't necessarily know this, but procurement is really slow. When it normally works, it's really slow. And that's okay, because the people who really need the stuff aren't really part of the process, okay? The users aren't part of the process. The procuring officials, the lawyers, all those other folks who are actually running the process, they don't care. They just let it run and run and run. Doesn't matter, it takes a long time. So suddenly, all that time, the luxury of time, all the wasted time was gone, because people needed stuff right away or they were going to die, okay? Right away or they were going to die. So suddenly the focus shifted from the procurement folks to the users, to the patients. And that was dramatic. That was dramatic. So for example, before the pandemic, I was in Italy. I was meeting with a professor who happens to lead the local procurement authority, okay? And they buy medical equipment for hospitals. And so I said, professor/director, I said, who is your customer? When you buy stuff for a hospital, who is your customer? And he was confused. And he said, well, of course, the doctor who's the director of the hospital. I said, wrong. I said, wrong. Your customer is the patient who's going to use this equipment. You have to think about the user all the time. In fact, that's a central problem in procurement. We don't think about the users. We don't decentralize authority and responsibility. We don't think about who's going to be using this stuff. And yet, in the pandemic, though, all that went away. The users are most important. So this is kind of an insight, but how do we institutionalize this insight? The answer is what we call in states, it's called Amazon.gov. That's a bad slang term for a formal initiative called the Commercial Platforms Initiative, sponsored by the General Services Administration. And on June 23rd, they awarded billions of dollars in contracts, no cost contracts, because the government isn't actually paying anything to Amazon. They awarded to Amazon Business, to Overstock.com, and to Fisher Scientific. And so now for the first time, users, federal users, just regular officials sitting at their desk can order off Amazon. This is revolutionary. You're taking the power away from the contracting officials and you're giving it to the users, okay? And this is really important because it changes the whole dynamic. Now, at first, it's limited to micro purchases. So we're only up to $10,000, okay? But that's real money around most of the world, okay? $10,000 is a lot of money. It's certainly a lot of money to me as a taxpayer. And users, federal users, not contracting officials, so we're institutionalizing this insight. Ironically, this started years ago. Congress started Amazon.gov years ago, but by coincidence, sort of Providence intervened that in the middle of the pandemic, we have this structural reform which reflects this new paradigm, the new paradigm that we're going to think first about the users and enable users to make decisions in the procurement process. And this, Margaret, has collateral questions, collateral issues, collateral questions we want to think through. It's not just in procurement. How do we ensure that users in any sphere of public activity, whether or not it's me as a recipient of Social Security, or is it somebody else who needs a good road? How do we ensure that users have a voice? Right now, if you want to speak about what roads are being built or should not, really the only voice you have is through a representative, and maybe if you use a toll road or don't use a toll road. That's a very, very muted voice. We need to figure out better ways to enable the voices of users. And that's what we're seeing. The pandemic is bringing that change forward. The next is what Laurence referred to as the competition disruption, which is for the first time, what we've all grown up with is the assumption that the government is a monopoly. A government agency can do what it wants. It can slow down a purchase. It can knock the vendors around. It doesn't matter. The vendors don't like it. They can go someplace else. There's incredible, sort of a selfish arrogance on the part of the procurement process. All of a sudden that changed because in the pandemic, all the governments were competing with each other. Holy cow. In fact, they were so overwhelmed that they started hiring agents because they didn't know how to do it. One of my students, Margaret, a former Green Beret, okay, a guy named Tommy Hendricks, okay, he had to, because the New York City procurement process broke down, he had to spend private money from the Rockefeller Foundation. Rockefeller Foundation gave him money not to buy body bags for New York, but to buy racks on which to put bodies in New York City because the procurement process broke down in important part because all these different agencies were competing with each other. Suddenly it was a completely crazy market, overwhelming the public agencies. There was all this fighting. So for procurement geeks, there are issues that we have to think through. How do we regularize competition? How do we regularize cooperation? We deal with all that stuff, Clary. From a big picture perspective, I want to make clear why we got in this box, okay? We got in this box because stuff that we thought in the United States of as private goods, which is healthcare. Healthcare in the United States is primarily a private function. Normally ventilators, personal protective equipment, all the things that a doctor needs to save a life, okay? All that stuff is bought through a private system. It's not public. All of a sudden, and I know I'm an economist would seize their head and say, you're not using the term correctly, private versus public goods, but I'm gonna use it anyway, okay? What were previously private goods became public goods. And that's what overwhelmed the procurement system, because suddenly the procurement system had to deal with all these things that are suddenly public goods. Well, nobody really noticed that, Margaret. Nobody really said, wow, suddenly a ventilator is no longer the job of the hospital down the street from me, but it's the job of the governor, okay? Suddenly a private healthcare system became a public healthcare system, and nobody blinked. Nobody really noticed it, okay? I got my first COVID test. I got my first COVID test from the Veterans Administration. I've never had any contact with the Veterans Administration. The nurse jammed it up my nose, okay? She was a VA nurse, okay? I'd never met a VA nurse in my life, but she was providing my health care. Suddenly we had the artificial divide we have in the United States between public and private healthcare, which doesn't exist in most industrialized nations. In most industrialized nations, healthcare is considered a public good. Everybody has a right to it, okay? Not so in the United States. The divide evaporated during the pandemic, and it raises real questions about what the next administration, whether or not it's a Trump administration or a Biden administration, will do about that artificial divide. Because I got to tell you, when things get bad, the divide doesn't exist anymore, and everybody has a right to healthcare. Everybody has a right to healthcare. The next thing was what Laurence referred to as the assumption disruption, which was that some of the assumptions, important assumptions that undergird what we do in procurement, and that has, again, that's a complicated discussion among procurement geeks. But what I wanted to emphasize is that what it pointed up is the need for trans-border cooperation. I'm going to speak to the General Services Administration next week, okay? They want to do a certain type of contract. And I say, it's actually with a person it's Maria Swaby. Maria Swaby's asked me to speak about a certain type of framework agreement. It's a very technical issue. I said, the most interesting thing about this innovation you're bringing to contracting is that it will be very easy for people in another country to use your contract, okay? So in a very corrupt country, like let's say Armenia, which has had very serious issues with corruption, or Myanmar, which is very far behind in terms of developing its procurement systems, a school teacher in these countries will be able to use, or a fireman or a government official will be able to use US government contracts, this trans-border cooperation. Maria couldn't care less about it. She just couldn't care less about trans-border. She said, don't talk about international stuff. I said, okay, but that's the reality. The trans-border cooperation is going to become really important. And this shades into the question that we'll be talking more about onshoring. The question is, how do we ensure a resilient supply chain? This is something that we have almost never discussed. I did a Google search. I did a research search. I did the other day. I'm writing an article on this. No one's ever talked about resilient public procurement supply chains. It just doesn't happen, okay? But our counterparts in the private sector do it all the time. A resilient supply chain probably means trans-border cooperation, because a trans-border supply chain is a better solution than a stockpile. The United States is stockpiling for the next emergency. We're stockpiling for the next pandemic, okay? We're ready to go. There was a failure in the national stockpile this time. It's in the Harvard Business Review. You can read it, okay? The Harvard Business Review says failure national stockpile, but we're gonna get it right this time. We're gonna shut the borders down, and we're gonna stockpile stuff for the next crisis, except if the next crisis is different than this crisis, okay? Just before the pandemic, okay, Secretary Mattis, you remember Secretary Mattis resigned in 2019, okay? Just before the pandemic, Secretary Mattis was sleeping in his clothes because he was so convinced that North Korea might launch a nuclear attack against the United States. He was so concerned, he was sleeping in his clothes. It's just as likely that we're gonna have a nuclear attack as we're gonna have a pandemic. But you know what, when the nuclear attack comes, the stockpile is worthless. We need to have trans-border cooperation so we have resilient supply chain to be able to reach other sources of supply. I think that's an important lesson which nobody seems to really be talking about. The next thing is the question of what we call in our legal spheres, we call convergence. The idea that all procurement law systems are the same. Why is that? Why is it when I can open the law of Belize? I'm sure if I opened up the law of Belize today, I would understand it completely. Is that because an American lawyer has written the law of police? Sometimes, yeah, sometimes no, okay? More often than not, the stuff is just ending up in the same place. The procurement laws are ending up in the same place, kind of by accident, but not really by accident. It's because the laws, and by the way, this drives our continental colleagues bananas, because our continental colleagues want to believe that God himself gave us the law, okay? These divine principles are embodied in the law. They're not. It's, you know, I'm a Lutheran. I'm a down in the dirt Lutheran. This is about the law reflecting pathologies, breakdowns in any given government. The law is intended to fix pathologies, and it turns out the pathologies are the same all over the place. That's why the law is the same all over the place. I went to Myanmar. I gave advice to Myanmar about their procurement law. Is that crazy? No, because Myanmar has the same pathologies as Poughkeepsie. Okay, it's the same problem all over the place. So what happened in the pandemic is that nobody really talked about this, Margaret, but all of a sudden we were having worldwide webinars. China, Russia, the United States, we were having worldwide webinars and everybody was talking the same language about solutions. We might be speaking, you know, one person might speak French or one might speak, but in procurement, we all speak the same language because we all have the same pathologies. That convergence has occurred almost unconsciously. And now everybody assumes that everybody has the same law. And this has important ramifications, not just in procurement, but more broadly. When you have a good body of law that reflects pathologies, and those pathologies are the same in one country to another, reform across nations becomes not a matter, Margaret, of common speechifying or saying, you know, we have to gather around principles. It means that you can affect reform in different nations laws simultaneously, recognizing that those laws are going to address. So for example, in our world, in public procurement, one of the things that's been long over the years is that when somebody engages in corruption, if somebody bribes the official building the bridge and the bridge collapses, there's been no instrument for compensating the victims, the people who get killed. And bridges, by the way, if you don't believe me, look at Genoa. Bridges collapse, and happened in Florida too, okay? Bridges collapse because of incompetence and corruption, but there's no vehicle for victim compensation. The Europeans are changing that rule. The Europeans now require that contractors pay victim compensation before the contractors are allowed back into the system, okay? Because we have common pathologies and now a common language of procurement, that human rights principle, victim compensation, can move around the world much more quickly, much more simply. And it also, the global market that Magda will be talking about makes that more possible. The last lesson from the pandemic is the protectionist one. And Simon Evan and the folks at St. Gallen University in Switzerland really produced some interesting research during the course of the pandemic, showing where import and export constraints are being thrown up by governments in the middle of the pandemic, which makes a lot of sense if you're Donald Trump, but doesn't make any sense at all if you care about human life, okay? If you care about the fact that that ventilator may not be needed in New York State anymore, it should be available in Italy tomorrow, okay? Because there are a lot of sick people in Italy today, okay? So an export constraint doesn't make any sense. And the reason they did it was for a very simple reason. It's not like they enjoyed compiling data and creating charts and boy, isn't this fun? Simon was doing it for a very simple reason. He cares about human life. He was concerned that people were dying because of these export constraints. This creates a really interesting opening for international organizations. It's a little counterintuitive. You think in times of trouble, we draw in. We count on our own government, unless you're American. We count on our own government in these times of crisis. Didn't actually turn out to be true. It turns out that international organizations become really important for two reasons that popped up during the pandemic. And they're separate reasons, and I just want to I'll close with just touching on these two reasons. The first one is the question of export constraints I've been talking about. Who is immune from export constraints? The United Nations. The United Nations can ship stuff all over the world really rapidly without worrying about export controls. So suddenly these international organizations become life-saving alternatives, alternative channels for really important equipment. The other reason international organizations became important is because during the pandemic, early in the pandemic, developing countries, I'm sure the people that Magda is working with on a regular basis, developing countries had to spend a ton of money. For instance, South Africa had to spend a ton of money on essential supplies, and they panicked They didn't know how to reduce their costs. South Africa tried to impose price controls, but that's really dangerous because if you impose price controls, that Chinese vendor selling masks, he goes to the next country over. So you don't want to do that. Price controls are not a good idea. So instead, the strategy had to be, I'm going to spend like crazy today in the hope that somebody saves my bacon tomorrow. And that savior has to be the international institutions. And in fact, you can see the World Bank doing it now. The World Bank is pumping in money to these developing countries to fill the gap left by the pandemic, to fill the fiscal gap. So in order to make sense of a response to an international crisis, a nuclear war, say, these international monetary institutions that can move money around, because it's actually easier to move money than it is to move masks. These international institutions that can move money and can promise they will move money when it's needed, they become as important as those UN planes that were flying around the world delivering supplies outside the export controls. So international institutions become critically important, both for supplies and also for sources of funding. And I think that's a very important lesson for us to carry away, because it means that we need to, we all know this needs to be done anyway, but it means that we need to strengthen, we need to celebrate these international institutions, because they are the key to survival if there's a genuine new international crisis, like, God forbid, a nuclear war. That's where I'll close, Margaret.
You know, in these online meetings, we always have to go through, oh, you're on mute, you're on mute. That just happened for me. Yeah, thanks, Chris. That was so stimulating listening to that. I want to go straight to Magda, but I want to come back to this because you raised several points that I think it'd be wonderful for us to have a discussion around. Maybe Magda can pick up on a couple and then we come back again. But where you ended is certainly the foundation, one of the foundations for why, you know, the Future Law Institute is doing what we're doing. Because we share one planet, we need to be thinking about what are the collective frameworks from a legal and policy level and the collective institutions to help us to address these collective challenges. So thanks for that, Chris. Magda?
Thank you, Margaret. Chris did such a great job laying out these super important issues, and it's hard to follow him, but I will try, because I want to lay it out maybe from a little bit different perspective, given my work with what are called developing economies, and I'll talk about, you know, what I think developing economies are in a moment. Let me try to share my screen, if you'll allow me, Margaret. And do a little song and dance with my own presentation. I hope that you can see it. And I want to start, if I may, with just a little story. I work as a consultant, primarily on public procurement advisory, but
also obviously on international trade policies. And I do a lot of work on public sector reforms. And last year, I was in a country in Latin America doing a training on how to modernize government procurement and what's required. And I went through my whole song and dance, and I did, you know, all the best practices, and whipped out OECD maps and World Bank and all that stuff that, you know, is so important to lay out a framework for what's appropriate. And then I shared examples of countries that have done it well. And at the end of the presentation, this guy came up to me, a member of the audience, and he said, Magda, you did a great job. Thank you so much for laying out all these wonderful practices, the best practices. And he said, I hope you won't be offended by what I'm about to say. And I said, oh, okay, let's see what this is. So I said, all right, you know, give it to me straight. He said, look, I know that it's important to lay out the best practices, but honestly, Magda, we just need good practices. We just need good practices. We need to understand what best practices are and maybe how to get there, but let's just make what we have now better. Because in this country, a lot of things don't work. Please tell people when you go out to do these trainings what to do when procurement goes wrong. Because in this country, a lot goes wrong a lot of times, very often. And that was a tipping point for me. My eyes were opened. It was like the Red Sea parted. I was like, wow, this is deep. And so one of the reasons that when I do my trainings or when I speak, I try to speak, even when I'm speaking to, the most, esteemed minds of the world. I really try to speak in a way that is that anyone would be able to understand, because as Chris said earlier, procurement is not always the sexiest topic, but you best believe that we all care about the public good. And if we all care about the public good, we better care about procurement. But how do we do that? I think it's by speaking in a way that resonates with people, with their everyday lives, with what impacts them. And when that gentleman said that to me, my outlook changed. And so I'm going to start, I think, by saying something, and I hope that those who are listening this afternoon or this evening or this morning, depending on where in the world you are, will allow me the opportunity to just say this very simple thing. I hope everyone understands what a supply chain is. So if I can just kind of back up to that, what is a supply chain? Let's start with that. You've got this, you probably have this, this mobile phone, right? You've got your mobile phone, and your mobile phone is made out of, the battery is made out of cobalt. In the simplest form, supply chains are just the global supply chains anyway, are just the connecting points between the sourcing, production, manufacturing, and delivery to the ultimate consumer. That's it in the simplest form. And so when you have that nice iPhone in your hand that you're holding, and it has this lithium battery, that cobalt that is essential to that lithium battery, it probably comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo and may have been mined by children, because that's the reality. And then that cobalt then is shipped off maybe to Korea or to China, and the production of the phone begins, the manufacturing, and then eventually maybe might end up at Apple somewhere, where they then distribute to your beautiful little hands. It is that supply chain, that change, that item that you get in your hand. That's why global supply chains matter. It connects products to people everywhere around the world. And nowadays, in the 21st century, people want more and more to be able to have, product. They want to be able to have what everybody else has. And so, part of what I'd like to share is really about that, that global supply chain. So, Margaret, people ask me all the time, Magda, kind of what do you see now that COVID has happened as the main things to come, the big issues? And so I try to say what I see, but I'm not a futurist and I don't label myself as one, but I am someone who works a lot in developing economies and some of the ones that have a lot of challenges. But what I do see is things that are happening that are making things a little bit better. So one, and Chris again touched on many of these, diversification of the supply chain. He talked about nearshoring, onshoring. I'll just call it diversification of the supply chain, because it used to be that many things were made in what's called the world's factory. We know it as China. And those days look like they're changing. Countries after COVID will want to see production happening more locally, or at least regionally, if they can't do local production. And I think that's something that we have to sincerely consider. And then protectionism. We saw export bans popping up all over the place on commodities that were extremely important for life. And yet countries were saying, no, I'm sorry, we need X amount for ourselves. And in some cases, we're not sharing whether other countries need it or not. And we don't care. And that led to the question, especially as a trade lawyer, well, what happened to the WTO? What happened to these bodies that are supposed to be, control mechanisms so that this kind of thing doesn't happen? And that was highly distressing to see these export bans, even if they were temporary. And obviously, WTO rules do allow in situations of extreme health issues, pandemics, national emergencies, national declarations of the sort, for countries to be able to impose necessary controls, including export bans. But it was unfortunate how it was done, because the information wasn't necessarily shared or announced that countries were going to implement export bans. Also, there was hoarding by countries, not just people. We all saw the television clips of people in the US, sadly, hoarding toilet paper and water and antibacterial gels, but we also need to know the governments were hoarding too. Let's not pretend that they weren't, because they were. And I think that's really sad. And in a time when clearly they have a responsibility to their citizens to ensure that goods and services are available to protect life and limb, but they also have a responsibility in a globalized society to share. And I don't know if you heard that thunder agreeing with me there in my local environment. And then the adoption of digital innovations. I think for a long time in public procurement, when you talked to digital, you talked about a big RFP going out and selecting, I don't know, Oracle, Microsoft, all the big wigs who would come in and SAP and introduce these, very sophisticated systems. I think that we're moving now into a world where cloud-based innovations, where APIs on your mobile phone can help introduce procurement changes to government in a really easy way, in module ways, so that they don't need to invest in kind of heavy IT systems that don't necessarily move with the times in a very agile way. So there's that. And then I think cooperative sourcing to potential suppliers or partners. Chris talked a little bit about this, and I'm going to put it in the context of international organizations, but I'm going to go beyond Amazon. I'm going to say Alibaba. I'm going to say that yes, I know it might be risque, especially if the US government is listening, but I think that we need to be looking at all these platforms. Entities should be able to purchase wherever they can in a time of emergency, as long as, and in fact, I'm going to share a couple of statistics in a minute when I get out of my showing the presentation, because it is up on the Google Drive, so anybody who wants to see it can see it then. I'm going to pop out. In fact, I have some statistics about this, how prices of PPEs went up exponentially, especially during the month of March and April, when things were looking dire. Not that they're looking a whole lot better today, but they were, that was the beginning and the peak on many ways in terms of procurement, in terms of the activities that were happening. I think, yes, obviously we should use international organizations. UNICEF is really good at procuring goods and services from all over the world. They've got a wonderful PPE platform, and I'll share the link in a moment when I talk about it. Also, there were some aggregators that came together. The government of Jamaica did a really good job of finding a DBE, I believe is their aggregator for PPE, and they used that to kind of get the best pricing that they could. So yes, we should use international organizations, but we should also consider places like Alibaba, places like Amazon, and there are other competitors that are perhaps less well known, but are available. All we have to do is kind of put in the structures so that the suppliers, well, their suppliers have already been screened, but there are obviously legal requirements and procedural requirements on the countries that are trying to use these platforms that they should, make sure are aligned with. And I would say also that governments need to do kind of three big things. They need to be adaptive, creative, and I also think they need to be attentive. In terms of being creative, I think they need to find supply chain enablers, and I'm just going to bullet point the ones here, and then I'll talk a little bit more in detail about them. Data is a big supply chain enabler, and here I'm not talking about the nice, fancy, big data, IT. I'm talking about regular old numbers that used to be around long before IT was around. Governments have to make decisions based on data, and not all all governments have been doing that, and they thought they didn't even have to in some cases, particularly in the developing world. Data is no longer restricted to industrialized countries. You know, the internet has democratized all of this, and consequently, there are commodity aggregators. There are I think there's Data Mundi, I think it's called, is another area where governments have access to commodity prices in real time. So why don't you use that data, policymakers who may be listening to this when it's recorded later on? Why don't you use that data in your decision making? You can do that even during COVID. And in fact, you should do it during COVID, because now there's more and more data, and it's even more available for everyone who's interested and has access to it on the internet. So that's one. Two, tech. There's a lot happening in the tech space. I mentioned a couple of things just a little earlier. There's blockchain, you know, this distributed ledger kind of thing where you can follow where things are in the supply chain from the moment you order all the way to the moment it gets into your hands, and who touches it and why and where. That's critical. And you can now subscribe to these things through monthly or yearly subscriptions. So this is not something that is available only for the most sophisticated countries. Even countries that are low or middle income have access to this information, and it's not constrained by legislation or anything of the sort that they could say is a restriction that they can't use. This stuff is available, and we need to start using it. And then I have this thing that I call explorative sourcing capital for development. Hold on to your chairs, because you may not be ready for this one. I'm going to propose, and here that you're talking to somebody who has been a staff member at the World Bank, at the OECD, and at the Inter-American Development Bank, all in procurement-related roles. I am someone who believes that we need to explore, particularly in countries that are considered developing countries, we need to explore sourcing capital differently. Maybe during times of crisis, a loan is not the best option. Maybe what we should do is maybe have countries that have high budgets do crowdsourcing for some of their needs, and then transfer some of that money to developing countries who would otherwise get a loan to buy the things they need. And then that capital could be properly used in a way that would not burden that developing country, and yet the industrialized country would have had, because it has income in its population, it could crowdsource some of its needs. It could put up a website that say, listen, we need this and we need these goods, and we're going to crowdsource for it. We're using the same GoFundMe as everybody else uses, because our budget, if we help these developing countries, they will have less burden and be able to be more developed, so that we're not constantly adding the burden of a loan to them. This is something that could be done. It's different, but so what? A lot of things need to be different now that we're talking about a different reality. We're here talking about the new normal. So let's explore really what that newness can be. Can we do crowdsourcing? Why not? Can we do budget transfers between poor countries or lower income countries and richer or industrialized countries? Maybe. We can develop mechanisms for all sorts of things if we want to. I think we just need to either work within the legal frameworks we have by expanding them, or crush them all together and create something next to them or above them that would make this kind of innovative, creative thinking more of a reality, so that we're not just talking about it in a bubble as hypotheticals, but we're talking about it as a plan, as an objective. My mother always said the difference between a dream and a goal was a deadline. Let's set a deadline for how countries that are struggling with COVID are able to get access to the funds they need. I want them to be able to have capital, but there isn't just the way of loans and then small grants. There are other ways. And yeah, maybe they can't borrow on the financial markets, but they can look to neighboring countries, to regional countries that are doing a little bit better than them financially, and say, hey, maybe we could procure together. Maybe you can use the majority of your funds and we can do some cooperative procuring. I know that in the beginning, of this COVID situation, some of the small island states, Cayman Islands, for example, turned to the UK and said, hey, we have this relationship with you. You know, you guys are able to procure things much more quickly than we do. Can you help us get this in? Within weeks, there was a plane delivering to Cayman Islands. Cayman Islands was one of the first islands to get things. Now, they're not known as a lower income nation, but they were able to come up with these creative solutions. And I don't think that we should let those creative solutions go to the wayside. We have an opportunity to build on what's been done, so let's take it. And then attentiveness. Governments need to pay attention to what I call supplier side easing, stressed labor, and transparency. In terms of supplier side easing, what do I mean by that? People are struggling right now, governments, but businesses too. They don't have any money. And many countries have decided they're going to lend them money, which was the case in the United States. By the way, that money ran out very quickly, at least the first round. And also people abused the money that they did get access to, buying cars and other things. So that means the internal controls weren't necessarily fully there when those loans were made to some of those businesses. But many suppliers, particularly small micro industries and again, in lower income countries, are suffering. They need access to capital fast. And I'm a proponent of digital payments. Let's make sure that every supplier can have access to digital payments between it and government entities when government entities want to buy from them during emergencies and beyond. That's possible today. So let's focus on how to make it a standard, particularly, again, in lower income countries. Let's also look at labor. You know, workers are out of work, millions are unemployed. Many of the jobs are not coming back if we read the press. But there are places where we can invest in local talent development, knowledge transfer. And I encourage policymakers to look at diaspora communities, particularly, again, lower income countries. You need to look at your diaspora communities, diaspora, for if you want to pronounce it that way, diaspora communities all over the world who have done well and who can then come back and share their technical expertise, transfer cash, give knowledge, and help build local systems for government to meet government needs instead of always having to supply outside domestic and outside regions. They can try to have diaspora communities be supportive enablers to micro and small enterprises in local communities so that they build that capacity that is needed in order for governments to have the support that they need from their own locals and for SMEs to get money, to get access to that capital that governments are spending outside of their countries and outside of their regions. And then transparency, you know, who is the ultimate consumer for government agencies? The ultimate consumer is the public. The ultimate consumer is the public. And a lot of times I think government agencies forget that the ultimate consumer is the public, and they want to, you know, they spend time and money developing these e-government procurement systems, which are fantastic and important. And in fact, international organizations praise those for many, many years, and many countries have great experience with them. But beyond e-procurement, beyond the system working well internally, the external relationship with the public needs to be enhanced. There are clearly specific needs from the public sector and towards the private sector, and there are specific needs between citizens and their governments. So there needs to be a system in place during times of crisis, and we're in the middle of it right now. I just saw a statistic this morning, for example, coming out of the US and the New York Times, that 17 states are just now hitting their peak in the United States. So, you know, clearly we're still in the middle of this thing. Let's find a way, governments, to make procurement accessible to the public in a way that is simple, and where engagements can be had in a digital fashion that it goes beyond. I'm not talking about social media and a tweet here or there. I'm talking about putting in place things like what was done in Singapore to be able to allow governments to have chat boxes set up to talk to people about their specific needs during COVID and which neighborhoods they were in. Let's use those digital innovations like was used in China and South Korea for contact tracing, or in Spain and Tunisia where they used robots dots to go out and talk to the public and say, you must, maintain social distancing. Let's use those things, those health screening sensors that we have in the US and in Singapore and certain states. Let's use those to improve how government engages with the public and make what government spends its money on more transparent, because it's not their money, it's our money, it's the public's money. Margaret, I'm gonna take a break here because maybe you have some questions for me, and I thought I saw something in the chat, but I think I wanna stop there and continue with questions that you may have for me.
Thank you, Magda, for that incredible contribution and thought stimulating. And yeah, I would like to open up for discussion now. It is interesting that what we have here in this panel discussion, we have gotten a very US North-centric global perspective, a global perspective from the US lens, and we've now gotten a global perspective from the developing economy lens. And what struck me is that there were so many common threads between both conversations. There's one I want to pick up first, which was both of you seem to be of the view that moving to commercial platforms and the agility that provides to public sector buyers is a good thing, and it's something that should be embraced. And Chris was talking about Amazon.gov, and you went as far as say yes, but also let's look at Alibaba and all these other platforms and all of that. And I want to just ask this question. Yes, I can see how we can buy these goods more quickly, more effectively, but we also will be giving up some levels of oversight in respect of that process. So maybe I could put it to Chris, who was speaking about we need to put the users' interests first. But then when you're talking about users, you seem to refer to the users as the procurement officers themselves, as opposed to end users, the people who may benefit from the goods. And so how do you marry this? Yes, the agility and the speed with which we can get stuff from these commercial platforms with, if one would, tend to suggest that one wants it, more oversight and control over how these procuring officers buy.
So a couple of answers. So first of all, actually, when in terms of thinking about the end user, being concerned about the end users being served, I am thinking about the actual user. One of my students last year actually wrote his thesis on Amazon.gov, and he is a major in the U.S. Army, and the Army Times did a survey of soldiers, U.S. soldiers who are being deployed abroad, and half of the U.S. soldiers being deployed abroad buy their own boots from commercial sources like Amazon. They are issued boots by the Army, but those boots fall apart. When you pull on the eyelets, they fall apart. And for a soldier who's being deployed to a foreign theater war like Iraq or Afghanistan, the most important thing, if they have to cover a lot of miles, is their boots. If they're going to survive that experience, they have to have good boots. So they buy their own boots. So they'll literally walk out to the plane wearing boots that they bought on Amazon, leaving their assigned boots back in their locker back in the United States. And that's a giant signal that the users are not being served. And so he was very interested in the pros and cons of using Amazon. But if the story isn't complete, and I take Magda's point about Alibaba too, that there are other commercial platforms and we should be open-minded about those. So there some funny things happened during the pandemic on this issue, and some issues that are serious public policy issues. So one of the things that emerged was that in June 26th, these contracts were awarded by the government to Amazon and to the other vendors. They didn't activate within 30 days like they were supposed to. And I and others try to figure out why. In the last few days, it emerged probably why what happened was that because now the contracts are live. You can go onto GSA and you can see the contracts are available. What stalled it was referred to as the Huawei ban. the United States decided to ban Huawei from the supply chain, and a few other Chinese companies as well. And it's really hard because, like, if you go to Amazon right now and you type in Huawei, you're going to get hundreds of products. Saying you got to pull Huawei out of the supply chain is really difficult. What's tricky about the Huawei ban is that while it's nominally about an espionage risk, the government says, oh, Huawei works on behalf of the Chinese government and will steal either government information or steal industrial secrets. It's not really clear, Margaret, whether or not that's the complete goal. Part of it seems to be a desire to ensure that the Chinese, by the way, have 4 times as many people as we in the United States. It seems to be to ensure that the Chinese economy is always smaller than the American economy. There have been academic studies on this, that when you have a hegemonic power and there's a new power coming to overtake it, the hegemonic power starts acting in irrational ways. That's what seems to be part of this. Is that I understand, and I'm sympathetic to the concerns about espionage from Huawei, because certainly the Americans have done the same thing. So I'm sympathetic. I'm sure they're valid at some level, but also there's a broader goal here of trying to crush the Chinese, to keep the Chinese down. And in that light, it creates an interference with the use of commercial platforms like Amazon, because Amazon, the commercial platforms have a really hard time adjusting. So to Magda's point about why don't we use Amazon, why don't we use Alibaba, or my point is the same, we have some problems because we have a government that has other goals, which may have to do with preservation of power. So that is the odd policy concern with using Amazon and Alibaba. The practical one actually arose during the epidemic, during the heat of the pandemic. The primary things that procuring officers needed was information about suppliers, whether or not suppliers were reliable. And they were doing all kinds of, you read the reports, they were doing all kinds of goofy things. They were like using lists of minority-owned contractors, because those were the contractors that they knew. And that's fine. I mean, that's the normal protocol that they would use those contractors. But they were going to those contractors not because there were any set-aside requirements, but because they knew them. The knowing, the knowledge, the familiarity was most important. And it really pointed up the fact that the procuring officers in a crisis need to have ready sources of information. So when they went through all those lists and those lists, the established supplier list didn't work, they turned sideways and they went to the open market. But in the process, they started relying on law enforcement officials. And only public buyers have ready access to the cops. Only public buyers can call up the law enforcement and saying, I'm using company X to sell me masks and I've never used them before, so are they reliable? And law enforcement will speak to a public body. So to Magda's point about why don't we use Alibaba and why don't we use Amazon, Alibaba and Amazon have a much harder time calling law enforcement, calling other government resources to check on the quality, the qualification of contractors, prospective contractors. So one of the downsides of outsourcing this function to the private sector is the private sector may not be able to draw on other public resources regarding information. So I agree with Magda that obviously I'm writing on this because I think it's a very important topic, but I think outsourcing this function to the Amazons and the Alibabas of the world raises some issues that we haven't fully thought through, and really brings us full circle to think, Margaret, is when you were talking about outsourcing, the most important question to ask yourself is this a mission critical function? And if it is mission critical, we shouldn't outsource it. The question we have to ask each other is procurement, public procurement, is that mission critical to the legitimacy of the government? And if it is to the legitimacy and effective functioning of the government, we should be very careful about outsourcing it to Amazon. Magda, I'll turn over to you.
I hear you. I hear you on that. Magda, did you want to say anything? Because, yeah.
I would just add just something really basic, is that there are also the lawyers in all of these countries who also can help serve on internal control for some of these issues. True, they may not have access to law enforcement like the U.S. does. We turn to law enforcement for everything in America. I mean, if your baby's missing milk, you can call 911 and they'll bring you some. And that's a true story, by the way. Look on the news. But there are kind of these controls that are available in other countries, and I think you have to do a sort of balancing. Do the risk outweigh the benefits? And what we saw in the beginning of this pandemic is, maybe some countries allowed their buyers to kind of go and buy on some platforms, but that was quickly kind of shut down because of this fear that Chris was just mentioning. I mean, and if we think about what that fear is it political, or is it because we can't do it because we're worried about quality? I would venture to say it's political, and I think Chris didn't put it quite that way. I'm not as diplomatic, but we're talking what it really is this about. It's about power and control. And that whole Huawei situation is about power and control. It's about not wanting to lose, I'm an American citizen. My parents are from the developing world, the Caribbean. And I understand some of the discussions that go on about power dynamics between industrialized and non-industrialized all the time. And that's really what the issue is. It's not, yes, it's true. From a perspective of control, we may not have the same level of control that we should have or be able to have if we were holding on and conducting procurements ourselves, or maybe not using suppliers that we're unfamiliar with. But that's exactly the point. During these types of situations, you have to step outside of what you would normally do. And it's interesting because many of the countries of the world have these policies, procedures in place for emergencies. What happened during COVID? All of that went out the window. They did not use what they're supposed to use in order to properly manage how they conducted their purchasing. And so I do think that it's an issue, but it's an issue that has to be weighed. And in my view, the benefits probably outweigh the risk, especially if you're a poorer country. If you're an industrialized country, maybe individual pockets are big enough that you can kind of do your own procuring. But if you're a poor country, you rely on your government big time. And if they can't come through because of kind of concerns about working with suppliers they're not familiar with, or using tools they don't entirely know, there have to be some other mechanisms that they use as at least a minimum of a due diligence. And I would say their legal, the attorney and solicitor general's offices in many of these countries can be a kind of clearinghouse for that. Maybe the chambers of commerce. You have to kind of use a different type of due diligence when you're from a country that's desperate. When that has a real, situation, and that doesn't necessarily have access to the same resources that many of the industrialized countries have. That's all.
Yeah, so a different type of due diligence, hearing what both of you are saying, is what we may be looking to develop to address these kinds of crises, procurement, and how countries and public sector buyers do it. And I hear alignment between you on, yeah, we have to find ways to be able to use these tech platforms. Yes, we talked a bit about the power, its use, and the dynamics between countries. But I do get a sense from both of you that we have to be more agile in terms of how we procure. But then how do we do that? What are the new frameworks? Do we have any ideas about what the new frameworks could be and how they could develop to address the new state, the new normal that we're in terms of procurement? Because I'll say this, your story at the top, Magda, I thought was very interesting about best practices versus good practices. And one of the areas that I'm reading a lot in right now is in complexity theory and complexity dynamics. And one of the strains of thought in procurement policy that is being developed right now is that we've always approached procurement, and traditional procurement models are approached as if they're complicated tasks. And therefore we seek to define good and best practices for a procurement exercise. But in truth, procurement is quite a complex task, which is different from the complicated. Complicated, there are many different parts, but every single time you put the parts together, you get the same result, right? But a complex where you have buyers that are human and sellers that are human and have prices that are constantly changing, and we have needs that we don't have all the information about and all of that. It's quite a complex task. And so is it that we need to be defining good or best practices, and I'll throw it out to both of you, or is it that we really need to start designing for more agility and innovation in our procurement system, and what would that look like? And I think, Magda, you began speaking a bit on that when you said adaptive, creative, attentive, and right. Putting that framework. Yeah.
ACA. Thank you, Margaret. Let me comment on that. Here's what I think. Today, building a really efficient and modern procurement system requires a change in how governments think and how they act on procurement. And for me, technology is the driver. I've become a technology evangelist. GovTech is a co-production approach that brings technology innovators and governments together to transform both the way government administers procurement and the way it delivers procured services to the public. So digital innovation is evolving really quickly, but so are public expectations of what their governments owe them. So legacy government e-procurement systems, as I mentioned before, they're made with these internal controls in mind, but little thought of service to the ultimate consumer, the public. Now, though, much like the private sector, governments are grappling with how to provide holistic services to their constituents, requiring going beyond re-procurement and determining which technologies to invest in, how to integrate digital solutions with existing procurement systems, how to recruit, expertise. That too is a big issue as we move to a more digital and more agile system, and offer citizens the transparency they've come to expect, and manage supplier competition while of course balancing security issues, because we've all been reading about, kind of hackers getting into government systems and demanding A, B, C, or D, breaking into healthcare systems, hospitals, and holding records hostage for ransom. So I think GovTech is a really good way. It can optimize procurement in a new way, bringing more transparency and efficiency to both how government functions and public expectations of government service delivery for improved accountability. But most importantly, these technology people are out there looking for solutions every day. They're dealing with problems every day. Now it's a question of government has the problems and has the resources. These technology folks and innovators have a lot of the solutions. It's, I think, bringing them together in a more, not in a more collaborative, but a more systematic way. GovTech isn't just, again, for industrialized countries. It's for any country that's serious about moving forward with a more modern procurement system to be able to have access and efficiency and agility in a way that is, real, that is valuable, that's beneficial, that doesn't take a long time. I saw I worked last year with the United Nations Development Project in Asia Pacific, and they've got this amazing program to increase transparency in public procurement specific to ASEAN. But that whole project is focused on how technology can help developing economies foster more open information exchange with their citizens, tackle integrity risk, and enable government savings that increase resource availability, particularly if we want to have sustainable development.
Yeah.
Chris?
Yeah.
Margaret? I hope I go off too much.
I want to push, go back to Chris, not necessarily with the same question, unless you have. I
want to follow up on Magda's idea. Magda, I mean, so Magda's idea about using technology to facilitate procurement is a great idea, and I completely agree with it, but we have to approach it holistically. And let me give an example. So one of the things that Magda put out there was using digital payments to making payments fast. South Korea, for example, has a system where many vendors deliver something and the same day they get paid, which is unheard of in government contracting. Government contracting normally
takes forever.
Later. Partly because the government's lazy and slow in paying, but partly so that the government has an opportunity to inspect the item. If you have same day payment, instantaneous payment, then the government really doesn't have an opportunity to inspect. And I asked this to South Koreans. It's from the Centralized Purchasing Agency. I said, so what happens to the performance risk here? And they said, oh, that's borne by the buyer agency. So they're affecting the transaction, and they pay the money, and the performance risk is going to get shipped to the buyer agency. Because if the item is defective, the money's already been paid, and the buyer agency has a lot of trouble. So understanding all that, you say, well, what's the solution? And the solution is it has to shift to the prosecutors. The prosecutors have to be able to bring fraud claims or bring civil fraud claims to when there is defective items being bought on the same day payment. And that means that to Margaret, picking up the logical corollary, the logical extension of what Magda's saying is, it really has to be all of government, that all elements of the government have to move in together. And that means that, for example, in the Justice Department, putting to one side the very sexy stuff that's going on right now in terms of COVID-19 fraud that Magda was alluding to. For by and large, on a year in, year out basis, most of the fraud cases that are being brought by the Justice Department are triggered by whistleblowers in the first instance, which means that the Justice Department all they're doing is following the money, okay? They're not responding to organic failures in the government processes. They should be, if they were concerned about making sure that the government worked well overall, they'd be bringing their own fraud claims. Instead, they're following the whistleblowers into the courthouse. That's what the data tells us. They're not responding organically to problems in their own house. That means logically in Magda's new world, where there'll be same-day payment and predictable performance failures, the Justice Department won't follow and deal with those organic problems. It also means that structurally, I mean, I'm speaking as an old American lawyer, and I've worked in the Justice Department. I take this stuff really seriously. If you look, for example, at the cockamamie lawsuit that was brought against the lady who wrote the tell-all book about Melania Trump, if you actually read the complaint, it's completely crazy, okay? When the Justice Department does these things, and most of the public thinks, oh, well, this is just politics. It's not just politics. The justice mechanism, the anti-fraud or the anti-crime mechanism is fundamentally losing legitimacy. So when we solve the problem that Magda quite creatively creates, which is same-day payment, when we solve the problem, it's not just making sure that the Justice Department responds to organic fraud, let's call it, but also that the Justice Department maintains its legitimacy. And this is true of any Ministry of Justice in any country, that it has to maintain its legitimacy day in and day out, because it really has to turn to solving the problems of government and not turn political. Because as soon as it turns political, the whole system falls apart. So this little thing that Magda raises, which is how do we affect same-day payment, it unfolds into a much broader issue of how we need to improve the entire government.
Can I add something just, and I'll make it short, Margaret, because I know you probably want to say something too. Just, I saw this recent survey from Boston Consulting Group, and I think it was Eastern Foundry. They surveyed like 100 investment firms, startups, and venture capital firms. And the #1 reason that tech-savvy enterprises don't bid on government contracts is the time it takes to win those contracts. The #2 reason is how long it takes to get paid. I mean, they cited other factors like lack of understanding of the government procedures, the complex contract processes, and they have maybe lack of experience with bidding on government projects. But governments are eager to jump on this startup bandwagon. Why don't, for digital payments, for example, that could be focused on small and medium purchases. It doesn't have to be the purchases that really require intense review. Not every procurement in the public sector needs the same level of review, as you all know. So maybe the area to begin with, maybe the area to pilot kind of, and I hadn't, same day payments, I wasn't aware of that, even though I was in Asia last year and talked to the people from South Korea, but I was just advocating for digital payments because that would make it faster. And I will say this, PayPal is one example, and I know there are other platforms, I'm just not thinking of them now, where you can effectuate a payment, but you can also raise a complaint through that platform and have the payment held and pulled back. I mean, obviously that means that digitally, because it's digital, unless the person has already actually physically removed the money. If it's a digital payment, PayPal has the ability to block it even after they've sent it to your bank, is what I understand. So maybe that same technology could be applied to kind of smaller or less complex or less impactful, less high risk procurement, so that we begin somewhere and we keep the levels of control that are appropriate based on what we're procuring.
Yeah. I hope people can see how sexy procurement can be and how interesting the discussion can be. I
don't know about that.
I couldn't get in between you all because there's so much fire and stuff going on, and it's great. I mean, this is how important procurement is. I'm seeing the rest of the time, so I do want to ask Chris a question, and then I want to ask you one, Magda, and we can bring our closing remarks into that. Chris, you've been a teacher for professor and you in government procurement, and for a couple of decades you've been doing this work or more. And I want to ask you, how has the pandemic changed your perspectives, if at all, on as a government procurement law professor? Has it changed your perspectives? Where do you see this going?
So it has, and I have to tell you the truth, Margaret. It's made me rethink my my own life goals. And for me, as an aging American male, it's really hard for me to talk about my feelings. But I'll try somewhere. But so the Chinese certify 50,000 people every year in our discipline, which means if the Chinese have they have 1.3 billion people. That means in a 7 billion person world, there's at least 200,000 people coming into our world every year. And the question is, into our procurement world. And they all need to be trained, because if they're not trained, they just veer off into corruption. I mean, we all know this because we've worked in worlds where people have veered off.
That's a big statement. That's a big statement. If they're not trained, they veer off into corruption.
Hell, I'm from Massachusetts.
They can veer off into corruption.
Yeah, no, I come from a very corrupt place called Massachusetts, and let me assure you, if they're not trained, they become corrupt very quickly. So how do you train all these people? And what the pandemic has done is the pandemic has allowed us to rethink how we do training. We do training online. It's made it possible to disperse knowledge much more quickly. And in a funny way, it's really, I do much more work now, Margaret, divorced from an institution, okay? I don't do work as GW. I take my brain and I work, I work here, or I work I was addressing the G20 conference earlier this week. I am moving my brain a lot, and I'm actually thinking very seriously about setting up a professors cooperative where professors would come in and share teaching in a Moodle setting. Wow. So what the pandemic has done is it's allowed us, for those of us who embrace change, and I do embrace change. I think it's a key, and quite frankly, as an American, it's one of our few strengths, is that we're very good at embracing change. I think what the pandemic has done is it's liberated us as teachers to think about how we can begin to address these bigger questions. At the end of the day, my job isn't to teach 200 kids every year at GW. My job is to figure out how we train 100,000 or 200,000 people effectively around the world if we really want to make the world a better place. So what the pandemic has done is liberated us to think in different ways about life goals that we had before that were kind of quiet or held back. And suddenly the pandemic and the enabling that we've learned during the pandemic has made it possible for us to achieve that, to reach those goals.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Chris. And Magda, I want to ask you, do you see any silver lining coming out of what's happened in procurement since COVID-19 began?
Wow, I actually see a couple of silver linings. I would say the first one is governments have really gotten their act together in procuring PPE for their people. They know where to get it. If they didn't know, they found out. They now have some reference prices. Many in the in countries that are considered developing countries. And by the way, for those who may see this a little bit later and may not be looking at this live, the World Bank defines developing countries, I believe, as countries making with gross national income of $11,900 or less a year, and who have not a good state of material well-being. And out of the 195 countries in the world, there are 137 of them. So that's a lot of countries that are in the developing country, or as I like to call them, evolving country categories. I'd say, so first, yeah, governments have figured out how to get PPE, and that's helping save lives, personal protective equipment and equipment to hospitals. So I think that's really good. Secondly, I've seen tremendous cooperation between international organizations and their member countries in setting up, online catalogs, making databases, and these price aggregators that I told you about, like indexmundi.com or globaldata.com in the UK. UNICEF has this wonderful entire page dedicated to data on COVID procurement, because they source products from all over the world for their projects, so globally. And then thirdly, I see there's a lot of risk tolerance that's being adjusted. Some governments did rapid assessments of their current policy and legal frameworks and then decided, all right, this is what we've got. We have a centralized system. We might need to decentralize during the pandemic so that we allow people a little bit more flexibility. And they've determined kind of what would work best for their country. Jamaica was really good at that, and I applaud them. They did a really nice job very early on, and they have a really good site called, I think it's covid-ppe.dhb.global COVID-19. And then I think on the supply side, cash flow is important, and so governments have made that cash flow important, whether it be to make payments to their suppliers, who then in turn can pay manufacturers so that goods can be produced and made available to the public. And we're not ending yet, but I would like to say on a positive note, don't be discouraged if your country is in the evolving country category and isn't quite functioning the way some of these fancier, sexier, more industrialized maybe countries are doing. Your country will go digital. Your country will get where it needs to get no matter what. Why? Because the market demands it. Baby steps will lead to giant steps. So hold on. And then secondly, I want to say, and lastly, so that I can give the mic back to you, Margaret, supply chains are resilient. I mean, they may bend, but they're not going to break forever. People will find ways to piece them together. And I think that's one of the greatest parts of what's happened with COVID. And if there's anything positive to be pulled out of it, that one I really like, that resilience of governments, of people, of individuals, of businesses, but also this whole idea of bending but not breaking.
Love that. Chris, you want to take a stab at that question too? Do you see a silver lining coming out of what's happening since COVID in procurement? Any silver lining?
I think so. I think governments are going to be. I agree with Magda. The government's much more responsive. I actually have a question for you, Margaret. Is because you're extraordinary in the procurement world. You are somebody who understands how to capture popular attention and really move people. And you're an activist, and that's.
I agree with that.
Activist.
Yes, you are.
It's very rare. And the pandemic has created another surge of interest in activism. But in my world, so when we were briefing the G20, it was an academic briefing earlier. These people were saying we've got to stop corruption. They were all focused on the sexy aspects of it. And old Professor Yukins said, all the anti-corruption devices actually are just garden variety good systems for procurement. They're not very sexy, but they work well both for the procurement system, but they're also a good way to catch crooks. So the question I have for you, Margaret, is how can we learn from you? How can we learn how to combine good systemic reform with things that are sexy, that will capture, as an activist has to capture, that will capture popular attention? what should we learn from the pandemic from you, Margaret, about doing a better job in leading reform?
Oh, that's a tough question. Here we go. I didn't conceive myself in that way as an activist. No, but I think, and it's not what you can learn from me at all on this issue, but I think if it's anything that I do, is that I see connections between areas of law, and in particular, the procurement law took my interest, the connection between that and impacts in society. And because I saw the connection very, very clearly, you research, what are the underlying philosophies driving these policies and these laws. And when you go there, then you realize, okay, there is a whole market-driven philosophy under how we drive the law. So I think it's taking a conceptual approach to law, not just these are the rules, but what is really driving these rules? What are underpinning these rules? And I think that's what I connected to, and I think people connect to. People like, yeah, why are people buying? Again, why are the governments buying? They're buying to serve us and to take care of us. And whose money is being used? It's our money being used. And therefore, we need to think more about this. And I think when we look at public procurement law and how it has developed, I think one of the areas that I have been trying to teach on through the Crime Procurement Institute and now through Future Law and the Procurement Innovation and Leadership Lab is bringing in the human, social, and environmental and elements and components into the buying exercise. It makes it brings to the fore. This is not a straight, how much does this cost? Is this good of a appropriate quality? It's going beyond that transactional approach to procurement and recognizing that procurement is about meeting needs. What is the why behind why we're buying? And if it's about the people, then it needs to be about the people. And so, yeah, I've been very inspired by your work, Chris, and your work, Magda. And so I think we can all learn from each other and how your work is critical and important, the way that you put it across as well. It's about how do we bring all of our diverse perspectives together and create a story that is accessible, a narrative that is accessible to the average person. Yeah, if there's anything, I think I maybe because I'm a little simpler in my mind, I'm able maybe to say it simply. I don't know, but thanks for the question. A strange question. You put it on me. You put it on me.
I thought it was great. I thought it was great. We need that, Margaret. We need you. And I love it. I thought that was a great question.
And we, yeah. And so I'm looking at the time. We were supposed to finish at 3:15, and that's all good. I want to thank both of you for being in this conversation with me. And I think we've identified several areas, and we are taking notes as well, because we want to be able to produce something in a few days, mapping the issues that we've identified in all of these different areas of the law. And so, what you all have been talking about, leveraging technology to make the buying transaction more effective, and also collaborative buying, and also how we deal with resiliency in our supply chains, all of these things that you all have discussed, we're going to try to map that. And then hopefully we could start developing new narratives for change in procurement together going forward. So I don't know if anybody has some final words to say before.
Thank you.
I just have two things to say. The first is just to, encourage everyone, stay positive. Mankind has been through this before. Not maybe our generation, but we as humans have been through this kind of thing before, and we have overcome it. That's why we're still here. So we are going to be here after this. We just have to learn from this, learn through what you go through. So we need to learn through what we've been through and apply those lessons so that we can come out of this better as a human population. So, and thank you, Margaret, for the opportunity to share here. Those are the two things I wanted to say. I'm very grateful, and I know Chris is as well. We're very grateful to have had the opportunity to be in this forum and to share with people who care about good governance, because that's really what this is.
Yeah, yeah. Chris, you have to say something. Last words.
I can't tell you how valuable these relationships are, because it's really hard to build bridges around the world. I devoted the latter part of my adult life to it, and you make it easy, Margaret. So thank you.
Thank you both.